So when were biological weapons first used? By whom and why?
They have been used in the past, but actually very infrequently, since the determination that bacteria and viruses are responsible for diseases at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century. The first acts of sabotage were undertaken by the Germans in the United States, where they used glanders against horses. It was not against humans as such. After that, there have been several weapon programs. Japan has used biological weapons on an experimental scale against Chinese targets and undertaken human experimentation on war prisoners for the duration of the war. However, large-scale biological warfare has not taken place. Most of the agents, and in that particular case toxins, which are poisons produced by living organisms, have been used as part of assassination plots. In other words, individuals were targeted rather than communities.
Have biological weapons actually been developed?
A recent review of open source literature conducted by Seth Karras suggested that 23 countries had, probably had, or possibly had a biological weapons program during the last century. Some of these we know quite a bit about because they have dedicated histories. These include the Soviet Union's biological weapons program, the UK and the US program. However, even with these dedicated histories, there's likely to be large gaps in our understanding, either because of the secrecy surrounding them or because we just don't have the documents. I want to point out as well is that the Soviet effort and to some extent the US effort can be considered as quite unique, so we shouldn't skew our thinking about biological weapons program towards them and only them. And these unique features include the length of time that they existed for and their size. What Karras does in his overview is suggest that of these 23 historical programs we can see some trends. Many of them, for example, were small, they had limited objectives, many didn't last for very long, and of course they were all conducted in secrecy.
Have non-state actors used or pursued biological weapons in the past, and why?
So in 1984, the Oregon-based Rajneesh cult spread salmonella across salad bars, incapacitating hundreds. Shinrikyo tried to disseminate biological weapons in the early mid-90s and largely failed. And then more recently, and perhaps more significantly, in 2001 there were the anthrax letter attacks, in which 5 people were killed and 17 odd people were infected. Something believed to have been perpetrated by Dr. Bruce Ivins, a researcher at Fort Detrick. Biological weapons have been developed and used for a number of different purposes. I think the association of WMD with biological weapons sometimes makes it easy to forget that biological weapons have multiple utilities. So to give you some examples, biological weapons have been used by non-state actors to incapacitate. The Oregon-based Rajneesh cult spread salmonella to prevent voters from voting in an election. Biological weapons have also been used for criminal purposes. The first person to be sentenced under the UK Biological Weapons Act in 1974, Kuntal Patel, poisoned her controlling mother-in-law in 2014. We also have several cases of biological weapons being used for sabotage purposes, the German program, but also other programs. And indeed, one of the main parts of the Second World War British program was anthrax cattle cakes, which were intended as a tool of economic warfare, as well as perhaps providing a means of retaliation against a possible German threat of biological warfare. So there's a potential deterrence purpose as well, although I think we need to be a little bit careful about biological weapons as a tool of deterrence. Other utilities include covert tactical use and counterinsurgency purposes, and then biological weapons of mass destruction have also been developed for strategic purposes, particularly during the Cold War, where both superpowers sought to develop weapons of significant destructive capability.
There are problems associated with identifying non-state actor, including terrorist programs. If the record is sparse and patchy for state development, then it's more so here. If there's issues over source reliability for state programmes, then certainly there is for non-state actor programmes. What we can say is that surprisingly few non-state actors, including terrorists, appear to have demonstrated the development of biological weapons. Certainly there have been some, and here we might associate confirmed use of biological agents with development. So we can point to, for example, the Rajneeshis during the 1980s, or Aum Shinrikyo, and of course the anthrax letters in the US. But then there are other instances where we have use by non-state actors that can't reasonably be associated with biological weapons development, and here we might think of the Dark Harvest Commandos, who put a parcel of soil containing anthrax bacteria outside of Porton Down. The fact is that these are quite hard weapons to develop, and they're much harder than is sometimes portrayed in the open sources.
What biological agents have been pursued for use as a biological weapon?
Well, different pathogens have been investigated over the years. One must know that certain pathogens are lethal to humans, other ones have an incapacitating effect, so depending on the types of effects the military wanted, they would have looked in different types of agents. In addition to that, certain agents were also developed for warfare purposes against animals and plants. So there are quite a variety of agents that were investigated. Today, as far as we know, there are no active state-run weapon programs for biological weapons, but most of the concern seems to be about human pathogens, notably anthrax, because it's a very hardy agent and something that can relatively easily be manipulated. On the other hand, there is a fear for agents such as smallpox because of the scourge against humans they were in the past, and today most of the people are no longer being vaccinated or no longer enjoy the benefits of vaccination. So for these concerns, a lot of discussion goes on about these types of agents. On top of that, we have lately seen outbreaks of re-emerging and newly emerging diseases, one of the most recent cases being the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, which spreads very rapidly and causes many thousands of deaths before the outbreak is contained. So these elements taken together, they actually are part of the threat we experience from biological weapons today.
Okay, if we start with states, again, I'm going to begin by saying that there's an awful lot that we don't know, especially when it comes to knowing with confidence what agents were produced and in what quantity. However, the sorts of agents that we know that were produced appear to be very much a reflection on the level of the maturity of the programme and also the reasons for having a programme. In the US and the Soviet Union, for example, they had substantial programs, and there was a range of intentions for those programs. These included to kill or incapacitate people, to attack over large areas, to attack agriculture, or to provide special forces and intelligence with BW-related equipment. Because of the reasons for the program, because they were so varied, we've also got multiple biological agents which were produced, developed, or indeed investigated. According to Ken Alibek, the former Soviet bioweaponeer scientist, BW scientists in the Soviet Union successfully weaponized the causative agents of a range of diseases, including plague, anthrax, smallpox, tularemia, Marburg, hemorrhagic fever, and other fatal and incapacitating diseases. And apparently they also developed genetically modified strains of pathogens. In contrast, other programs had much more limited objectives, and so there were much fewer agents that were produced or developed. The German program during the First World War, for example, targeted animals, and in particular horses, and were told that they had no interest in causing human casualties, and that was reflected then in what they developed. In terms of non-state actors and the agents that they were interested in, well, we certainly don't have the variety displayed by the Soviet Union and the US. With reference to the instances that I mentioned before, we see that they produced the causative agent of anthrax, of salmonella. They also seem to have produced botulinum toxin. And since 2001, there seems to have been a number of individuals that were arrested for possessing or attempting to acquire ricin, which of course is a toxin.
Can you describe what biological weapons production facilities might look like and involve?
In past programmes, you have a sense that the size of the production facility depended on how mature the programme was and the objectives of that programme. So you definitely see variety in the production facilities. The Soviet Union programme, for example, was sufficiently mature that they had many facilities engaged in biological weapons. In addition to 4 military microbiological facilities, there was a complex of pharmaceutical facilities known as biopreparat that were engaged secretly in the development and production of biological agents. One of those biopreparat facilities was at Stepnogorsk in Kazakhstan, and that was a key production facility. The site itself consisted of 25 buildings, and Building 221 was the main production facility. It was 6 stories high, and cultures of microorganisms were grown in giant fermenters. We're told that in a single 3-day production cycle, 1.5 metric tons of concentrated bacterial slurry could be produced. I mean, truly this was an enormous production facility. However, the scale and the size of the Soviet production stands in quite some contrast to other state-level programs. For example, during World War II, the Germans believed, apparently correctly, that the Poles were employing biological weapons against their personnel, and they report finding a makeshift microbiological lab supporting these operations. The purpose of the programme was different, so was the environment in which these activities took place. So I think it's worth remembering that there appears to be this link between purpose and production facilities. At the other end of the spectrum are production facilities used by terrorist groups, at least that we know of. When Aum Shinrikyo moved to mass production of its botulinum toxin, for example, they are said to have used 200-litre drums, and a production run involved 10 of these drums.
How have past scientific and technological advances been misapplied?
I think there are a number of examples of this. In the latter part of the 19th century, the work of Koch and Pasteur led to the identification of the causative agents of many diseases. And it's perhaps little wonder that biological weapons programs of the Scientific Foundation began to follow from this. In particular, I think what was important was understandings of contagion and advances in understandings of contagion. And they're important for 2 reasons. One was that the notion of contagion created the possibility of one initial infection leading to tens or even hundreds of casualties. And this also aided in covert biological weapons use, as the origins may be much more difficult to determine. So contagion was a factor. I'd also suggest that growing research in the 1930s on aerobiology was also important, and something which later captured military attention. This expanded the possible uses of biological weapons and the means of potentially delivering biological weapons, from contaminating food or water to include the contamination of the air that an enemy breathed, which is quite a significant step. There are other things. I think in the 1960s civilian research on freeze drying also had an impact. It enabled the possibility of having dry powder weapons which could retain their effective properties for much longer in storage. So the science and technology certainly matters. Particularly these examples of contagion, aerobiology and freeze drying are important. Potentially in the 21st century we're seeing concern around gene editing technologies as well, which potentially has a game-changing effect, potentially.
Is there concern that biological weapons might be developed again?
Absolutely there is concern, which is why a healthy and robust biological weapons convention as the latest embodiment of the norm against the hostile use of disease, and a scientific community which is engaged, is so really very important. The concerns that are expressed seem to have multi-dimensional facets to it. So, for example, is the changing nature of conflict and violence making some attributes of biological weapons attractive again? Perhaps this isn't going to change the calculation back to the days when the interest in biological weapons was driven by large area coverage or mass effect, but we need to remember that past programmes investigated biological weapons for reasons other than this. But I think the main concern about biological weapons being developed again revolves around advancing science and technology. Knowledge about disease and disease-causing mechanisms, target population responses, etc., and advances in biological weapons development in the past has been intimately linked. Now, with the very rapid advances in the life sciences and the convergence of life sciences with other science and technological areas, there's real concern that the knowledge which may have prevented advancement in the past, or the technical hurdles to producing biological weapons, which had been just too high for all but the most committed, are being eroded or being lowered. I'd still say that developing a biological weapon which has more than a very local effect is still not as easy as some make it out to be, but nevertheless we have to remain alert and we have to be concerned. The dual-use nature of the technologies associated with biological weapons development means that we are never going to be able to entirely reduce the risk of biological weapons development down to zero. So, as I say, this is why we need a really engaged scientific community and a strong and robust biological weapons convention. We need to ensure, even in the face of these changes in the nature of warfare and the rapid advances in science, that the calculation is made that biological weapons are just not worth pursuing.